Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Good morning. My name is Andy Sahlberg, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today to the 46th annual Saturday with Sherlock Holmes at the Pratt Library. Sponsored by the three Scion Societies of the Baker Street Irregulars, the Six Napoleons of Baltimore, Sherlockians of Baltimore, and Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City, in partnership with the Enoch Pratt Library. This program was started in 1980 by the much-beloved dean of the Baltimore Sherlockian community at the time, Phil Sherman. Both Dan Thomas and I spoke at that very first program. Since then, the program has been a major venue for both scholarly and whimsical presentations on the world of Sherlock Holmes and the 40-year account that we have of Holmes's life and that of his friend and chronicler, Dr. John H. Watson. In 2013, the book Sherlockian Saturdays at the Pratt was published by the Baker Street Irregulars Press, collecting 28 of these presentations, and the book sold out. For those of you who may be new to the Sherlockian universe, we are adults who contend that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were real people, and that their adventures, though heavily costumed, actually occurred. This is called the Grand Game, and as the mystery writer Dorothy Sayers wrote, it should be played as seriously as a cricket match at Lord's. We consider the author of almost all of the 60 tales to be Dr. Watson. In 1940, Arthur Conan Doyle's son attended the Baker Street Irregulars dinner and was perplexed because his father's name was never mentioned. He said, "Where does my father fit into this?" And he was told, well, he was sort of Dr. Watson's literary agent. He never forgave the Baker Street Irregulars. We refer to the 60 stories as the Canon. Hence, we are starting with our tongues planted firmly in our cheeks, and usually the wit runs high. Today, we celebrate Conan Doyle for the consistent role that he had in presenting the 40-year chronicle of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, whatever that role may have been. The three Sherlockian societies sponsoring this program meet at various times throughout the year. There is usually a scholarly presentation, a discussion of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and a quiz about that story. Our membership includes people who, as I like to say, are seasoned Sherlockians, and also those people who are reading the stories for the first time. All are welcome. There really are very few egos in the Baltimore Sherlockian community, and everybody, I know that it's intimidating. I've said this for a few people this morning. I know it's intimidating to walk into a room where you think everybody else knows all the stories. It doesn't matter. We were all there. Everybody's welcome, and you're not gonna be made to feel badly because you're not a Sherlock Holmes expert. Don't worry. Just welcome. If you would like to join with other like-minded people and have a good time, please come up to me during a break, and I would be happy to let you know how you can get more information. Greg, what's the website they can also find that out at? SherlockBaltimore.com. I would be remiss if I did not express our gratitude to our partner, the Pratt Library. In particular, I want to thank Genevieve Purchase, Deputy Chief of the Central Library and State Library Resource Center, Bernard Smith, manager of the AV team, and his staff, JP, what's your last name? There you go. And he's been great this morning, and I don't think we could have had a better liaison with the library this morning. And the Pratt Library print shop crew, who put together this fine program for us. We could not do these programs without the Pratt. And I want you to know how much we value your collaboration and assistance over these 46 years. So, open that door to the magic portal, put your phones on vibrate, and go with us to the world where, as Vincent Starrett said in his poem 221B, it is always 1895. The theme of this year's program is our favorite portions of the canon. And I thought I'd share a little bit about my own favorite. My own favorite is at the very beginning of the 40-year chronicle that we have of Holmes's life. A Study in Scarlet was written in 1886, but it wasn't published until the following year. It was the very first introduction that the public would have had to Sherlock Holmes. But it starts not with Sherlock Holmes, not with a mystery, but with the melancholy story about a down-and-out physician in London. I would like to talk about the first couple of chapters of A Study in Scarlet. Watson, in chapter 1, Watson relates how he took his medical degree in 1878 and proceeded to Netley to go through the course prescribed for surgeons of the Army. He was then attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers as an assistant surgeon, and before he could join it, the Second Afghan War broke out. He joined his regiment in Kandahar and at once entered into his duties. He says the campaign brought honors and promotion to many, but for me, it had nothing but misfortune and disaster. He was transferred to another brigade, which fought at the fatal Battle of Maiwand. There he was struck on the shoulder by a Jezail bullet, which shattered the bone and grazed the subclavian artery. He explains how he would have fallen into the hands of the enemy had it not been for the devotion and courage shown by Murray, his orderly, who threw Watson over across a pack horse and succeeded in bringing him to the British lines. Watson explained that he was then removed with other soldiers, wounded soldiers, to the base hospital at Peshawar, where he was struck down by an enteric fever. For months, his life was despaired of, and when he recovered, he was so weak and emaciated that the medical board decided to send him back to England and allow him to recuperate on a pension. I had neither kith nor kin in England and was therefore as free as air, or as free as an income of 11 shillings and 6 pence a day would permit a man to be. Under such circumstances, I naturally gravitated toward London, that great cesspool into which all the loungers and idlers of the empire irresistibly drained. There I stayed for some time at a private hotel in the Strand, leading a comfortless, meaningless existence, and spending such money as I had, considerably more freely than I should. So alarming did the state of my finances become that I soon realized that I must either leave the metropolis and rusticate somewhere in the country, or I must make a complete alteration in my style of living. Choosing the latter alternative, I began by making my mind up to leave the hotel and to take up my quarters in some less pretentious and less expensive domicile. I think it is one of the most beautifully written beginnings of a story in literature. It's modern, its style is more like the novels written 50 years later, such as George Orwell, than 50 years earlier, such as Poe. It has pathos, and immediately makes the reader sympathetic to Watson as a character. It is self-deprecating, as Watson relates his spending habits, and it gives no real idea about all that is yet to come. Holmes does not appear until page 5 of the Beaton's Christmas Annual, in which the story was published. It is all about how this injured, recuperating, financially careless physician came to be in need of less expensive living situation. What a setup. Watson's meeting of Stamford, his old dresser at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. We have two physicians who trained at St. Bartholomew's in the audience. Watson's meeting with Stamford occurred in a bar, subtly reinforcing the seediness of Watson's life at the time. And then the next phase of the setup begins. Watson told Stamford that he was trying to find whether it's possible to get comfortable rooms at a reasonable price. Stamford responded that, strangely, Watson was the second person that day who had used that expression. He then described Holmes as a decent but strange fellow who has mastered the medical sciences. What a wonderful irony when Watson states, "I should like to meet him," I said. "If I am to lodge with anyone, I should prefer a man of studious and quiet habits. I'm not strong enough yet to stand much noise or excitement." All of us in this room know what's coming, and who among us can read that without giggling, like you did? The story is still about Watson, and the joke is on him. And Watson knew that the joke was on him when he wrote all that, because all of this occurred in 1881, 5 years before Watson wrote A Study in Scarlet. He had been living with Holmes all that time, and he knew the life it led to. It makes me love Watson for his literary skill and his portrayal of his unassuming self. But there's still a couple of pages before we meet Sherlock Holmes. As Stamford describes Holmes's eccentricities, when we finally do meet Holmes, he is bending over a table in a laboratory, and then he yells, "I found it, I found it." Stamford finally says the words that we Sherlockians love. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "How are you?" said Holmes, cordially, gripping Watson's hand. And then Holmes said, "You've been in Afghanistan, I perceive." "How on earth did you know that?" Watson asked in astonishment. Good old Watson, from the very beginning. How many times in the Canon have you heard Watson say, how on earth did you know that?" By the end of chapter 1, Watson has completely changed the tone of the story from a quiet description of his injury, recovery, and squandered existence in London to an exciting puzzle in which he is trying to solve. Who in the world is this fellow? In chapter 2, they have moved into Baker Street, and Watson is trying to share what he learned about Holmes. The tone of chapter 2 is completely different from chapter 1. This chapter is about comedy. Now, you have to remember that Watson was a skilled physician and surgeon who, under any other circumstances, would be respected for his intelligence, skill, and experience. There's no need to denigrate Watson, but Watson did so himself for thousands of readers. Watson related that Holmes was ignorant of the Copernican theory of the composition of the solar system. He compiled his famous lists of Holmes's knowledge. Knowledge of literature, nil. Philosophy, nil. Astronomy, nil, and so on. All this could be serious, but Watson and we knew that it's all hogwash. As I said, Watson had already been living with Holmes for 5 or 6 years, and the cases we know as A Study in Scarlet, The Speckled Band, and perhaps The Resident Patient, Noble Bachelor, and Second Stain have already occurred. On writing this, Watson knew full well that Holmes had a wonderful knowledge of literature, philosophy, and geology. Watson then criticized an anonymously written article that he had read in which the author stated that from a drop of water, a logician could infer the possibility of an Atlantic or a Niagara. Watson called it ineffable twaddle. He told Holmes that the author of the article must be some armchair lounger who evolves all these neat little paradoxes in the seclusion of his own study. Holmes then told Watson that he was the author. Oops. You have to love Watson. He didn't have to include that in the story, but he did, showing him a bit twaddling himself. Watson ends the chapter with yet another self-deprecating episode. He viewed a person out in the street and wondered what the man was looking for. Holmes said, "You mean the retired sergeant of the Marines?" This really bugged Watson, who views it as a brag and bounce. So when the man shows up in their room, Watson figured he'd prove Holmes wrong and give him his comeuppance. Watson asked the man what he did, and of course, Holmes was right. And with this, the chapter ends. Watson's ability to change the tone of the narrative and keep the reader enthused is remarkable. Chapter 2 did not have any of the poetic pathos of chapter 1, but it gets the point across with humor and efficiency. After all, this is all prelude to a mystery. Still, you might not know that from chapters 1 and 2. Watson is patient, not rushing the main purpose of the novel, but is sharing his own mystery about the personality of his flatmate. One of the reasons we love Sherlock Holmes and the stories is because of the relationship between these two people. The underlayer of chapter 2 is about the beginning of this relationship. And then the adventure begins. Our first speaker today is Daniel Thomas. Daniel Thomas, Godfrey Norton in the Baker Street Irregulars, is a trial attorney practicing in the Baltimore metropolitan area, specializing in complex family law litigation. The Sherlockian who started this program, Phil Sherman, used to say that Dan tore asunder what the good Lord had brought together. Dan has spoken at 45 of these 46 programs, including, as I mentioned before, the first one. Reintroduced to Sherlock Holmes in the 1980s by Phil Sherman, Dan served as Gasogene 20 of the 6 Napoleons. In the tradition of Ron Knox, he plays the grand game and has embarked upon the campaign to instill in followers of the Canon the conviction that Sherlock Holmes lived and still lives, tending his bees on the slopes of the Sussex Down. Dan refuses to believe that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was anything more than a literary agent for Dr. Watson. Dan will speak on In Memoriam, Sherlock Holmes. Daniel?
Thanks, Andy. Good morning, everybody. I am not going to speak about the canon itself, but rather the introduction to the canon, the preface. And the preface was written by, I forgot his name, Christopher Morley. Anyway, he was a very, very, very unusual person. And I want to explain why I've chosen the preface rather than something from the guts of the canon. It's because Christopher has a real relationship with Baltimore and with this very building in which you all are sitting. He came to Baltimore in 1900. His family was from Pennsylvania. His father moved them down here. His father became the head of the mathematics department that was at Johns Hopkins. Christopher lived here from 1900 to 1906. When he arrived in Baltimore, he was 10 years old. Now, 10 years old is sometimes that you would expect someone who could become acquainted with Sherlock Holmes, but listen to what he has to say. This is in Christopher Morley's own words. Let me preface this by one thing. This is during a period of time that everybody thought Holmes was dead. Christopher says this: I was too young to know the wave of dismay that went through the English reading world when Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty supposedly perished together in the Reichenbach Falls. And I can remember the somber effect on my 10-year-old spirits when I read the closing paragraphs of the memoirs. I put in about 2 or 3 years in reading everything else by Dr. Doyle on walks downtown to the Enoch Pratt Free Library on Mulberry Street in Baltimore and got a book. When one found in the library a Conan Doyle he had not read, he began at once on the way home. It was quite a long trudge from Mulberry Street to the 200 block of Park Avenue, and the tragedy was that often the book was actually finished before the walk home was done. But all in all, I knew in my deepest of intellects or instincts that Sherlock Holmes was really not dead. So you can imagine that thrilling excitement in 1903, wasn't it, when the Return began printing in Collier's? Well, that's true. It was 1903, October to be exact. And at that time, The Adventure of the Empty House was published. The one thing I don't understand is that you're given to believe that there was nothing new printed about Sherlock Holmes during the period between 1901 and 1903, or 1900 and 1903. That's not so, because Collier's and Strand Magazine printed The Hound of the Baskervilles in serial form from October of 1901 to April of 1903. In any event, we want to start off with a look into the preface itself. And really, this talk is going to be more about Morley than it is about a 5-page introduction to the complete Sherlock Holmes. And by the way, you can still buy the complete Sherlock Holmes. It was printed in 1930, but the identical thing can be printed now. Get it from $14.50, and it has that introduction in it. He starts off by this. Doyle was very unfair to Watson because he painted him and said in one of his autobiographies that Watson was really much of a deadhead. He had no sense of humor, and in the whole time that he was in existence, Doyle never heard him make one joke. Well, Morley says that's not true. Give the man a break. Let's look at the Valley of Fear as an example of his little perky personality. At that time, both Watson and Holmes were speaking about Professor Moriarty. And Watson had this to say: the famous scientific criminal, as famous among crooks as... Watson was interrupted by Holmes. My blushes, because of course Holmes is expecting him to say Sherlock Holmes. And then Watson perks up and says, really, Holmes, I was about to say he is unknown to the public. Even Holmes had to remark that was a distinct touch, was the words used. We're told then that there's other evidences of the tenaciousness and fun-filled carefreeness of Watson. And he does that by pointing out that we look at the unpublished tales and the names that are given to them by Watson as evidence that he's in for fun. He's trying to goose the public into reading Sherlock Holmes, reading about Sherlock Holmes. And there's things such as the sinking of a Dutch steamship, the Friedland, which almost cost Holmes and Watson their very lives. The notorious canary trainer, the repulsive red leech, and my personal favorite, the notorious giant rat of Sumatra, a story for whom the world was not ready to be advised. He then goes on to say, after his impeachment of Dr. Doyle, that the numerous people, places, and things that were contained in the canon are described in such a way and brought to people's attention in such a way by Watson that people were drawn to a reading of the 60 stories. There was Mrs. Watson. My God, poor Mrs. Watson. But he was concerned. This is Christopher Morley, who, by the way, was known as Kit. He was the way that he could describe these people made them a part of the reader's family, so to speak. And this was one way that they were made to read the canon. In addition thereto, it was the questions that arose from the reading that caused them not to just read the canon, but to study the canon and read the stories over and over in order to maybe find out what an answer to a very simplistic and unimportant question. Like in the Studying Scarlet, what did James Samerson have in what book did he have in his pocket during the time that he was involved? What happened? Who bought Watson's Practice when it was sold? What college did Holmes attend? All of these things have been written about it over and over again. He then does something that I was amazed. He devotes the last 30% of his introduction to the complete Sherlock Holmes talking about Doyle. And I have to say that I certainly admire Doyle as a writer. He has very few peers, and none when we're talking about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. But as a man, I think he leaves something to be desired. I mean, first of all, he was a pompous ass. But I guess that really wasn't such a bad thing in those days, because men of his age and in that age of history, I guess most of them were pompous. But one of the things he did, which is inexcusable, he treated women unfairly. I mean, he was absolutely diametrically opposed to the woman's vote. And he opposed it in writing and verbally throughout his lifetime until they actually got the vote. Next, he took a great interest in spiritualism. And he went all the way. I mean, he went on with some of the craziest ones of all. In fact, his great friend Houdini, and he had a breakup over it. Houdini used to believe in spiritualism, but he found that there were all charlatans out there. And he tried to convince Holmes of this. And they ended up not speaking for the rest of their lives. Next, we have a situation that is almost inconceivable to me. Holmes not only was pressing on and on in his spiritualism, and by the way, you can't blame him particularly for that, because he had just lost a son in the Great War, and he was trying to contact that person. Now, I lost my beloved wife a year or so ago, and by God, if I could find something that I could speak to her again, I'd do anything in the world for it. But he took it to his farther extent, and absolutely, the pinnacle of his idiocy when he was dealing with this subject was that he wrote an article that appeared in the Strand magazine in 1920. He produced 2 photographs. And what were these photographs of? They were purportedly of 2 pixies or fairies flying around a woman's head. And he's trying to convince the public in London that this was something that was true and factual. He met the lowest ebb of his popularity, I imagine, at that time. We'll finish this little talk off as far as this my professional dislike sometimes of Doyle. He met a young lady in 1897. Jean was her name. He was married at the time, married to a very lovely woman, Loretta, not Loretta, what was her name? Well, we're going to call her Loretta for the sake. But anyway, he fell in love with Jean, mad, head over heels in love with her. And as I say, he was married, and his wife, unfortunately, at that time was very meek and not well, but still there. And this Jean was an outgoing personality, brilliant mind, great conversationalist, loved animals. Oh, and also a trained opera singer. Does that bring anybody to mind in the canon? In any event, Doyle loved Jean, and my God, his family, not Loretta, actually it's Louisa, not Louisa, was supposed to know about her, but his family, his complete family did. This is the mother of his two children, Louisa was. And anyway, she was kept in the dark, and the family knew all about it. He told Jean one thing, though, well, two things, actually, that while Louisa lived, he would not divorce her. And further, he would not engage in any physical acts with Jean during Louisa's lifetime. Well, Louisa made it pretty uncomfortable for the two of them. She lived 9 years. Now, that's 365 days a year for 9 years. Now, Doyle was in the prime of his life. He was about 35, and Jean was 15 years younger, naturally. And I can imagine the Doyle household on a daily basis where the doctor would call up, "Darling, how are you today?" And he's waiting for that deep silence to follow. Well, inconveniently, she spoke down, "Sitting up and taking nourishment." Now, that went on for 9 years. Well, I mean, Doyle was in his mid-30s, late 30s, and he still was expecting something to go on in his life involving sexuality. And 9 years was a long time. And he was almost suffering from a breakdown, a nervous breakdown. Now, this seems somewhat incredulous, as carved on his tombstone when he died, "Steel true, blade straight." I don't know what it means, but it sort of indicates a manly man who isn't going to suffer from a nervous breakdown. So here's what Doyle did in order to try and keep himself from that suffering. He engaged in cricket and golf. Now, as a golfer myself, I can tell you that ain't the way to rest down and take it easy. But can you imagine when Louisa called down and said, "I'm okay"? Oh, God, he's got to call Jean and tell her, well, she didn't give us the convenience we wanted today, and damn it, I got to play golf and cricket again. Well, let's see what Christopher Morley said about Frank. Doyle himself must have been a singularly lovable person. To back up its conclusion, he told us the story of an event that was portrayed in one of Doyle's autobiographies. On this day, Doyle and an elderly gentleman were traipsing up a steep and a narrow hill. And this is what the autobiography says. The nervous complaint from which he suffered causes him to fall down occasionally. As we walked up the narrow path, I heard him fall behind me, but judged from the sound it was a slither, and he could not have been harmed. Therefore, I walked on, as if I had heard nothing. He was a fiercely proud man, and my instinct told me that the humiliation of being helped up would bear greater than any relief I could have given him. Well, as the recipient of a fall and a broken hip, there aren't any falls that you take for granted. So, but this is the reason that Morley finds that, well, let's take it one further. I'll read you what he has to say. And it says, Morley comments on this conclusion. I can think of no truer revelation of a gentleman than that. I think they both ought to be institutionalized, to be perfectly frank. Well, let's get back to Morley. He went, in 1906, he went back to Pennsylvania, went to college, graduated from college. He then became a Rhodes Scholar and went to Oxford. Oxford was attended by who would be the greatest Sherlockian that Britain had produced, and that is, you've already heard of him, Roland Cox. And he is the one that perpetuated the game, and we all love to play in it. He is remembered as probably being the primary Sherlockian of his day. After graduating from Oxford, Morley returns home and gets a job with Doubleday and Company, becomes a writer, becomes a publisher, and he founds the Saturday Review for Literature, and in that there is a monthly column. In that monthly column, Morley mentions Sherlock Holmes occasionally, and then more and more and more, until in the early 20s, or about the middle 20s, that this column becomes a newsletter of Sherlock Holmes, the first newsletter, unofficial newsletter of Sherlock Holmes. And Morley was born to be a Sherlockian when he was 11 years old here in Baltimore. He formed a little club with 3 more fellows where they would discuss the antics of Sherlock Holmes. And he called it the Sign of the Four. And when his younger brothers, Felix and Frank, became older, they joined. And when they joined, Morley tested them unmercifully on the readings that they did of Sherlock Holmes. And this is what happens today in our scions, where tests are given for membership. You telling me I'm over time?
Way.
All right, I'll sum it up pretty quickly, because the most important thing, the man founded the Baker Street Irregulars. It originated with the 3 hours to lunch club, which became the Irregulars, and it was formed in 1934. It was the first Sherlock Holmes club in the world. It beat the London club by 1 day. And the first dinner they had was December the 7th, 1934. Anyway, he was succeeded by Edgar Smith, who was the then executive vice president of the General Motors Corporation, and who affectionately was known for some reason as Buttons. And I thank you all for listening to me. And Andy, I wanted to tell you, you were 7 minutes over time.
Up next is Matthew Hall. He is current Gasogene of Watson's Tin Box. Matt is an Australian by origin, but is now American, residing in Maryland, where he is a scientist at the National Institutes of Health, leading a drug discovery program for rare diseases. Matt has long been a devotee to Sherlock Holmes, but only discovered that there were Sherlockian and Doylean communities about 8 years ago. He built up the courage to attend meetings just as COVID arrived, and he attended many Zoom meetings before his first Sherlockian in-person meeting at the 2022 BSI Empire Conference in New York. He hasn't looked back. Matt's home science society is the Red Circle of Washington, D.C., and he is also attends, as I said, Watson's Tin Box, where he's currently the Gasogene. And he attends the Baltimore Science. Matt will speak on, this is in over the years, even though we have a theme, speakers often choose to ignore it. And this is in really that spirit. It's fully in the spirit. He's going to speak on Simon Goodenough's Sherlockian murder dossiers.
Thanks. Thanks, Andy. I thought I did a really good job of staying on topic, so we'll see how we go. Okay. That looks pretty good. That is a really big screen. All right. Well, thanks to Andy and also to Greg, who I know put in a lot of effort organizing this in the Pratt Library as well. So yes, I'm going to talk about Simon Goodenough's Sherlockian murder dossiers, and you might be thinking what and who, and I'll tell you the what and I'll tell you the who. It's pretty amazing. We're in the 46th year of this. I've been collecting these programs of the meeting recently, and I will get all 50 together by the time we get to 50 years. So yes, I'm going to talk about my favorite publications of the canon, which I think is on topic. And that's because I can't choose between most of the 60 stories that Doyle put together. So these books are called murder dossiers. It's on the cover there, and they were created by a gentleman named Simon Goodenough, a British man in the early 80s, and they were published by Webb and Bauer in the UK. So they're from the canon, but they're Sherlockian. The books were created in the style of the murder dossiers that were originally created or invented by Lynx and Dennis Wheatley, who you see on the right here, in the 1930s. These books were original works of fiction, but they weren't narrative novels. They were composed of a collation of case documents, and they acted as a presentation of evidence that was literally compiled into a dossier. Along with documents like police reports, interviews, each book contained complex items that were bound in or attached: photographs, letters, physical clues. And it's wrapped in a cardboard folder, as you see there, with a little bit of, on the examples that you've got on the left of the slide, with a little bit of string to tie them all together. And at the end, once you've worked out who done it, there's a section that can be unsealed for a full explanation of the cases. 50 years, and it says Prince of Thriller Writers over here under Dennis Wheatley, because that's what's on his headstone. So that's pretty cool. 50 years later, Webb and Bauer republished these books in the late 1970s, and that was the lead-in for Goodenough to create the Sherlock Holmes stories. These murder dossiers were really innovative. They were made in the 30s and rarely replicated. The main reason they've been rarely replicated is they're really complex, and they're probably very costly to produce. A late 70s review of Murder Off Miami, which was the first book, gives a sense of just how it's not a book, they say, but a carefully manufactured set of clues, pictures, police reports, and bits of notepaper. There were problems to solve, like finding large quantities of human hair to put in the evidence envelopes, which you can see on the left here, which are part of the dossier. They had to come from convents in Europe and India. It took months of work to assemble the whole book, but it does look exactly like the originals. So this is just the reproduction, the reprints in the late 70s. And they're hard-boiled crimes with complex clues. One even involved a torn-up photograph that you had to pull out and put together, and when you do, you get a couple naked in bed. It's not Doyle and Jean. And this is the 1930s, so it's pretty remarkable. The Sherlock murder dossiers are then definitely not pastiches, they are the stories, and each one is based on one of the three novels, Study in Scarlet, Sign of Four, Hound of the Baskervilles. The first book, of course, the first book was A Study in Scarlet, invites the reader to match your powers of detection against those of the great Sherlock Holmes. They differ a little bit from Wheatley's books in the 1930s. Wheatley compiled evidence as a dossier. There was no narrative fiction story. It was really a puzzle. It's not a novel. Goodenough took a slightly different approach. The Sherlock novels were narrated in first person by Watson, and so these could be converted to diary entries that connected the evidence that was put together in the dossier. In A Study in Scarlet, it ends with Drebber's police statement of what occurred and Holmes's explanation of how he solved the case. So you follow along. In the latter two stories, a sealed section at the end is included, much like the originals, and you can see that on the left here. This is a list of the evidence. The copy I have now is not unsealed, so I haven't gotten and had the heart to break it open. So the reader has the chance to review the story, so I don't know how it ends. But if you've never read the story, you would break this open and then find out what really happened. Actually, I want to comment on the right-hand side. The coverage of the UK bookseller said, "The case books are certainly a curious piece of publishing. Simon Goodenough let his imagination run. There are pills, wedding rings, calling cards, handwritten letters, newspaper cuttings, photographs of footprints. He obviously enjoyed himself." And Goodenough said, "I hope the Holmes fanatics will have fun with it, but that people who aren't fanatics won't be put off." I think that's how I feel about every single meeting I go to. When I first read one of Goodenough books, it absolutely took me into the world of Holmes and Watson, and it absolutely changed the way I think about the books and the world that they were in. Now I imagine those when I read any story. While Simon Goodenough may not have been a member of any Sherlockian community, there are some wonderful examples of playing the game. So for example, you can see on the right-hand side here, page 1 of the first book. It's a letter from Simon Goodenough, signed by him, to the director of the publisher, offering the documents from Watson's tin box, produced out of the rubble like buried treasure, from the site of the London Cox & Co building, bombed during World War II. It's a perfect start, and it sets the scene for the original evidence for the case to be made available as a dossier straight out of the tin box. And Goodenough really innovated how we think about these stories, and he brought them to life through the evidence. He created documents that, some of which aren't mentioned directly but are inferred. Telegrams, newspaper articles and advertisements, monographs, whole monographs abound in, letters, death threats, and even the invitation to Mary Morstan and John Watson's wedding included in here. One endearing touch is that as you look through it, you can see over on the top right-hand side there that on Watson's notes, Holmes is scribbling over them, making corrections and adding commentary to the story, which is really wonderful. Physical items, where am I here? Oh, yes, okay. You open up an envelope and you get a threat. Physical items were also included, three-dimensional items. On the right there, you can see that. It might be counterintuitive for you for a book that you have to close and lay flat, but Goodenough identified small items that he could slip in. My favorites are the ring from the Study in Scarlet that you can see there, and one of Mary Morstan's pearls from the Sign of Four. There's a few things here on the right-hand side that you can look through. I really love the hair of the curly-haired spaniel that was found on the moor, and Farrow's phosphorus paint is particularly close to my heart. On the Sign of Four, there's a calling card from Sherlock Holmes, and on the bottom left you can see on the back he sketched out the scene of the crime. And there's some other wonderful items there as well. Rarely mentioned in the original stories are the documentary evidence that were created by Scotland Yard, things that the police would have been doing while Sherlock was inspecting. Crime scene photographs, police mugshots. These are also included. You can see Sholto dead next to his chemistry equipment on the left there, which is wonderful, or tiny footprints of the person who had broken in and committed that crime. My favorite personal items are the letters written by Watson from Baskerville Hall. You can see them there on the right on the appropriate letterhead from Baskerville Hall. Look at me, Andy. I'm pausing to check the time because I'm doing such a good job. Okay. The concept was very successful. The 3 books were published in the UK. They were also republished and recreated in the US, and in French, Italian, and German. That included recreating all of the evidence, all of the documents for republication in those countries. And they're my favorite Sherlockian books. So why am I talking about them today? The answer is that they were the original inspiration for the 60 evidence boxes held by Watson's tin box, Scion, and created by its co-founder, Paul Churchill. Churchill had read Goodenough's books in the 80s and he began collecting his own canonical artifacts. His initial goal was to have one artifact for each of the 60 stories. Over 1,500 artifacts later, Paul's evidence boxes, which you can see in the middle, became legendary in the Sherlockian world as he displayed them at numerous meetings. What he couldn't find, he made. He became known as a master forger and found numerous genuine letters, documents, and telegrams, items that candidly became the very one. It's easy to see inspiration for Paul in Goodenough's creations, and after his passing, Paul's passing in 2008, the boxes were bequeathed to the Tin Box Society. We meet the third Monday of every month. Please come along. And they reside in Debbie Clark's home, which you can see in the photograph there in the middle. That's just some of them. If you want to know more about them, there's a wonderful podcast from the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere podcast that you can follow up on. The legacy continues at our meetings. The story is discussed, the evidence box is opened, and each item is described. Here are some examples. It can get awkward when a pistol comes out of the box in a bar, but if you can't come to our meetings, you can see you can go to watsonstinbox.org and photos of every single item in every single box is available digitally. So as I was really obsessing about this, I have a blog, and I wrote a blog post called Calling Simon Goodenough because I really wanted to talk to him. I was kind of stalking him. I think I'd worked out where he'd lived. But I'd had no luck making contact. And so I'd had this blog post, and I was lucky enough that a lady named Carol Baxter, who happened to live in Gaithersburg, almost exactly where I live, was a genealogist who'd been working with Simon on their common surname interest. And so she put us in touch. Simon now lives in the West Country of the UK. He graduated from Oxford, he taught in the US Virgin Islands, and then he was involved in publishing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and created an incredible number of books. He was unaware that his Sherlockian books were still remembered, let alone admired, and unaware they'd catalyzed this whole creation and creativity in the Sherlockian world that lives on. I had a chance to ask him about them, and so I just have some comments from him. He said he loved the idea that the dossiers spawned such interest in industry so far from Baker Street. He says, I planned out all the content and what we would need in terms of letters and telegrams and everything else. And then, with a researcher, they would get original examples from the archives, and they'd work with the designer to place their fitted quotes or modified forms into the story. For example, placing an advertisement into a newspaper on the correct date in similar typeface. And there's a great example here on the right where I've circled the Found in the Brixton Road advertisement that's so famous. And the surrounding text I took a lot of working is from the original page of the London Evening Standard in March 1881. Everything else on that page is the original newspaper. Then they just worked in the one advertisement. All the photos in the book are colleagues involved in one way or another with the publication. You'll find me, Simon, in a study in Scarlet as Jefferson Hope on the evening of his capture. So that is the author. If we used, or the literary agent anyway, if we used a police document at the time, we would go to Scotland Yard to get that, or a police archive. It was painstaking work. We planned to publish The Valley of Fear, but time got away from us and we were unable to do that. And I hope Sherlockians haven't found too many bloomers in the dossiers. They were always one of my favorite and most complicated projects, not only for the detailed research and planning, but also because of the enthusiasm of those who enjoyed them. I was entirely sucked into the Holmes world for the period of production and publishing. So it was really pleasing to find Simon after all these years and to sort of draw a connection, not just for Simon to what we're doing, but back to understand the original creator of these books that I love so much. I'm really pleased that he could learn about the wonderful legacy that Sherlockians have created. So obviously thank you to Simon, who will watch a recording of this talk at some point. Thank you to all of you for listening and for going on this journey with me. And finally, I would add that, I don't know if Andy mentioned, there's a quiz at the end of each of these meetings. You're supposed to be paying attention because you get a couple of questions from each speaker and you'll answer the quiz. The winner today will get a copy of The Hound of the Baskervilles, Simon Goodenough book. That will be a, ooh, yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Our next speaker is Evelyn Herzog, a lifelong Sherlockian who's the principal unprincipled adventuress of the adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes and is an important part of American Sherlockian history. Having picketed the Baker Street Irregulars dinner in 1968 for not admitting women at the time, Evie went on to found the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes and was one of the first women to be invested in the Baker Street Irregulars in 1991. We are so lucky to have Evie living here in the Baltimore community, to which she moved after she married a Baltimore native and former speaker of at this program, John Besh. Evie will be speaking on Sherlock Holmes' early progress in his attitudes toward women, a case of identity to the Copper Beeches.
I bet I have to lower this. Audible? Yes. No pictures from me. My talk today is about how we learn more from the language of the Sherlockian canon than just the details of each investigation. Watson's physical descriptions of the characters add an emotional layer to their words and can hint at their thoughts and attitudes. When we find a change not only in a character's language but in their tone, even if the character is Sherlock Holmes himself, we are at liberty to draw conclusions. Today I want to draw some conclusions from the texts of two early stories, A Case of Identity and Copper Beeches. The chronologists place A Case of Identity in 1888 or 89 and Copper Beeches in 1890. Recently enough, I think, that Holmes may still have been assessing the former case while handling the latter. Even a genius needs to learn as he goes along. In both these cases, Holmes is approached by a young woman seeking his help. Although Holmes solves both cases, he treats these two clients very differently because he has judged them differently. This sense of judgment is echoed in Watson's language. In A Case of Identity, Miss Mary Sutherland comes to Baker Street to tell the story of how her fiancé, Mr. Hosmer Angel, disappeared from his cab on the way to the church on their wedding day. She is bewildered by his disappearance, sleepless with worry, but certain of his true love, and she begs Holmes to find him and reunite them. Here is how Watson describes her. There was a tap at the door, and the boy in buttons entered to announce Miss Mary Sutherland, while the lady herself loomed behind his small black figure like a full-sailed merchantman behind a tiny pilot boat. Sherlock Holmes welcomed her with the easy courtesy for which he was remarkable. So Watson is snarky about her to us, but points out that Holmes behaves like a gentleman, with the subtext that Holmes must privately dismiss her, as Watson does. Miss Sutherland begins by explaining why she has come. I came to you, sir, because I heard of you from Mrs. Etheridge, whose husband you found so easy when the police and everyone had given him up for dead. Oh, Mr. Holmes, I wish you would do as much for me. I'm not rich, but still I have 100 a year in my own right, beside the little I make by the machine, and I would give it all to know what has become of Mr. Hosmer Angel. I would say that Watson has arranged that we are immediately struck by the way she babbles. And we are not so much struck by the fact that she not only is financially secure, but has chosen to work for a living. We hear Holmes draw her out about her finances, though once again, the torrent of her words may make us think there's nothing worth listening to. Actually, she shows herself to be dutiful and even generous with her family, and also financially sensible. She decided to take up work as a typist, which brings in salary for her personal needs. More importantly, I should have said personal wants. More importantly to Holmes, she has shown that she has innocently put herself in the position of being a cash cow to her mother and stepfather, and has thus provided to Holmes the possible basis of the whole case, which becomes clearer as Mary recounts her stepfather's attempts to keep her out of society and her mother's support of the stepfather's rules. As I dare say you all know, Holmes's research proves that Mary Sutherland's fiancé has actually been her stepfather in disguise, aiming to keep her at home supporting him and his wife, who is her mother. Holmes confronts the stepfather, Mr. Windibank, making it clear that he has his eye on him. But at the point in the case where Holmes should now explain it all to the client, we get this. Holmes is speaking to Watson. "And Miss Sutherland? If I tell her, she will not believe me. You may remember the old Persian saying, 'There is danger for him who taketh the tiger cub, and danger also for whoso snatches a delusion from a woman.' There is as much sense in Hafiz as in Horace, and as much knowledge of the world." To many of us, this is simply outrageous. After his confrontation with Windibank, Holmes himself has just said the following to Watson. "There's a cold-blooded scoundrel," said Holmes, laughing as he threw himself down into his chair once more. "That fellow will rise from crime to crime until he does something very bad and ends on a gallows." This gives the lie to Holmes' implied opinion that things will be all right if he just lets Mary keep her belief in Hosmer Angel. And he laughs. The Sherlockians who are furious at Holmes for the close of this case are justified. Not only does he not treat Mary like a client, but he's leaving her in the hands of a villain. Two villains, in fact, for what kind of a mother was Mrs. Sutherland? Well, I would like to propose that at some time soon after the conclusion of this case, Holmes began to rethink his assessment of Mary Sutherland. The trouble was not in his observations, but in his bias, and he must have begun to suspect himself. For starters, I believe that, still without telling Mary, Holmes somehow arranged to get Windibank hauled in for some previous crime. And I further believe that Holmes chastised himself for treating a client this way and determined to behave differently in future. To support this supposition, I cite many changes in the way Holmes treated his female client in the Copper Beeches case, which, as mentioned before, took place perhaps only a few months after this one. Ironically, Holmes is at first offended by Violet Hunter's case, since she writes that she is coming to see him to ask whether she should or should not accept a situation which has been offered to her as a governess. Well, harumph. He's biased against her already, but things change as soon as she appears. She was plainly but neatly dressed, with the brisk manner of a woman who has had to make her own way in the world. "You will excuse my troubling you, I am sure," said she, as my companion rose to greet her. "But I've had a very strange experience, and as I have no parents or relations of any sort from whom I could ask advice, I thought that perhaps you would be kind enough to tell me what I should do." "Pray take a seat, Miss Hunter. I shall be happy to do anything that I can to serve you." I could see, Watson says, that Holmes was favorably impressed by the manner and speech of his new client. He looked her over in his searching fashion and then composed himself, with his lids drooping and his fingertips together, to listen to her story. I submit that Holmes has learned more about assessing a woman client than when Mary Sutherland had arrived at his door. Miss Hunter goes on to explain the oddness of the job offer. Of course, she will care for the family's little boy, but in addition, she must wear a certain dress that they will provide, or sit where they direct her, or cut her beautiful hair short. Also odd is the excessive salary being offered. She senses that something's wrong, but she's been out of work too long, and poverty forces her hand. She tells Holmes, "My mind is made up that I will accept it. I thought, however, that before taking the final step, I should like to submit the whole matter to your consideration. I thought that if I told you the circumstances, you would understand afterwards if I wanted your help. I should feel so much stronger if I felt that you were at the back of me." To which Holmes replies, "At any time, day or night, a telegram would bring me down to your help." Watson tells us a fortnight went by. during which I frequently found my thoughts turning in her direction and wondering what strange side alley of human experience this lonely woman had strayed into. The unusual salary, the curious conditions, the light duties, all pointed to something abnormal, though whether a fad or a plot, or whether the man were a philanthropist or a villain, it was quite beyond my powers to determine. As to Holmes, I observed that he sat frequently for half an hour on end, with knitted brows and an abstracted air. But he swept the matter away with a wave of his hand when I mentioned it. Data, 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 he cried impatiently. I can't make bricks without clay. And yet he would always wind up by muttering that no sister of his should ever have accepted such a situation. And before long, she sends him such a telegram, and both men entrained to Winchester to meet her. She has a tale of a strange house indeed, and a strange family with a cruel little boy and an absent older daughter that no one speaks about, not to mention hostile servants, a fierce guard dog, a closed-off wing of the house she is forbidden to enter, a stranger watching the house from a distance, and the creepy discovery of a second hank of chestnut hair exactly like the one she'd had to cut off to get the job. In response, Holmes says, "You seem to me to have acted all through this matter like a very brave and sensible girl, Miss Hunter. Do you think that you could perform one more feat? I should not ask it of you if I did not think you a quite exceptional woman." So, of course, she does go back to the house, and together she, Holmes, and Watson discovers the secrets of the house and the family, and virtue triumphs. The fact that Holmes has learned that an ordinary woman can be relied upon is a remarkable development from the man we met at the beginning of A Case of Identity. It's no surprise that Watson mistakenly suspects romance. The unstated fact that solving the case means that Violet Hunter is out of a job again is taken care of by Watson's assurance to us that Miss Hunter is now the head of a private school at Walsall. Although there's no evidence, I'm inclined to think that she may have been the beneficiary of hush money from the Rucastle family to keep things quiet, at least until this story was published. And so Sherlock Holmes actually praised and worked successfully with a woman. Huzzah.
Thank you, Evie. S. Brett Morris worked his way through school as a performing magician. He's a mathematician by training and started his professional career as a cryptologist for 25 years with the National Security Agency. He has taught at Duke, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington universities, and has been invited to lecture at over 100 universities. For 17 years, he was the editor of the Scottish Rite Journal, the largest circulation Freemasonry magazine in the world. You may have seen him on the History Channel or the Discovery Channel whenever they have a program about the Freemasons. He is also the author of The Idiot's Guide to Freemasonry. He is the past Gassagene of Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City and a member of all 3 Sherlockian societies sponsoring this program. Brent has published many Sherlockian articles, including a chapter in Out of the Abyss, the Baker Street Irregular Press manuscript series book on the adventure of the empty house. Brent has emceed this program himself many times. He will be speaking on the perplexing problem of the puzzling proposition.
It's really hard to answer the question, what is your favorite thing in Sherlock Holmes? Because there's so much good stuff there. And I was going to do on the Red-Headed League, and I started on that, and then I told Andy, no, changed my mind. So let me put out to you a judgment call I want you to make. Imagine you overhear a little snippet of conversation. You're on the elevator, you're on a street corner waiting for a bus to come, you're sitting in the lobby of a hotel, and this is what you hear. Dude, the weekend was amazing. I went to the beach with my girl and some of our buds. We caught a few rays, fired up the grill for burgers and dogs, popped a six-pack, and played the Frisbee. Now think about that. Do you think you've overheard a native English speaker? To someone familiar with English, it just doesn't sound right. The final use of the definite article is awkward, non-idiomatic, and a giveaway of a likely earlier enrollment in English as a second language course. We just don't talk about playing the Frisbee. Okay, now imagine you overheard the following comment from The Sign of Four by Sherlock Holmes. And he makes the comment to John Watson talking about a study in scarlet. Watson has published a study in scarlet. And Holmes says to him, detection is or ought to be an exact science and should be treated in the same cold and unemotional manner. You have attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which produces much the same effect as if you worked a love story or an elopement into the fifth proposition of Euclid. Now, do you think you've overheard a student of Euclid? To someone familiar with geometry, it just doesn't sound right. The use of the, quote, fifth proposition of Euclid, end quote, is awkward, inappropriate, and a giveaway of possible early enrollment in a remedial mathematics course. Now, while I'm sure the difficulty is obvious to the reader, how do we get the slides up there? There's a button I bet I have to push. Wait a minute. Let's see. No?
Click on the left where it says 1. No, on the screen. Look on the screen.
Oh, on the screen.
You're bringing the cursor up to the...
I've dealt with this problem. I'm just going to do it this way. I'm going to reach under here.
All right.
And... Nope. Yep, there you go.
All right, great. Thank you. Now, I'm sure that the difficulty with the reference to Euclid's fifth proposition is obvious to anyone intelligent enough to seek out a symposium like this. But just for the record, I'm going to put down the information. And so we'll begin with first things first. What is the fifth proposition of Euclid? Matt, what do I hit to get the next slide? Just
Down arrow, space bar, any of them should.
space bar. There we go. There is a artist's conception of Euclid, and there is a drawing of the fifth problem. Euclid was a Greek mathematician who flourished in Alexandria about 300 BCE. Little is known about him personally, but his fame comes from his geometry book, Elements, arguably the most important and influential textbook ever written. And I say that because it was used for 2,000 years as the only textbook in geometry. I think most authors would be happy if they could get their textbook used for 20 or 50 years. 2,000 years is setting a pretty high standard. Euclid's Elements is divided into parts that are called books, and they contain propositions or theorems of geometry. Book 1 starts with 5 common notions and 5 postulates, which are the fundamental rules or axioms of geometry. Now, the terminology that we use has changed a little bit over the centuries. We talk about axioms today. Back when they started printing Euclid in English, they had postulates. It had a slightly different meaning. Now, based upon these basic rules, the propositions can be demonstrated, or as we would say today, proved. A proposition is a theorem, and then it's put in the book, and then you prove it. And you all have been through this before. There are, in fact, 13 fifth propositions and elements. Each book starts as proposition 1, proposition 2, and so there are 13 fifth propositions. So which of the 13 would Watson have thought Holmes was referring to? Most likely it was the fifth proposition of Book 1, the famous Pons Asinorum, or Bridge of Asses. This is considered to be the first difficult problem in the elements. And what you have here on the screen is the drawing of the bridge, the diagram that's used in Proposition 5 of Book 1, and that's what they say looks like a bridge. It's also thought to allude to the difficulty that poor students have in getting over it, or perhaps because it serves as a bridge from the easy to the hard problems. The first 4 propositions suck you in. They're easy. Geometry, it's going to be a piece of cake. I'm going to knock this out until you get to the fifth proposition, the Bridge of Asses. Oliver Byrne, an English mathematician, produced an edition of Euclid's Elements. He printed it in colors so you could see angles and sides and things in colors. And I think that his okay. There we go. I think that this helps you understand better why that might have been called the Bridge of Asses. And what is Proposition 5? In isosceles triangles, the angles at the base equal one another, and if the equal straight lines are produced further than the angles under the base equal one another. And that is a hard theorem to prove, the first hard theorem that you get to. So here's the simple explanation of Holmes's comment. He referred to a geometric theorem, well known to students for millennia. And to drive home the infelicity of Watson's embellishments, Holmes suggests the additions are like working a love story or an elopement into the theorem. A jarring juxtaposition indeed, perhaps akin to putting ketchup on ice cream. And yet, the metaphor is weakened by the reference to the fifth proposition, as there's a much more famous fifth object in Euclid's Elements, an object that approaches the blinding splendor alluded to by Edna St. Vincent Millay in her sonnet, "Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare." It is a concept with which mathematicians spent 2,000 years trying to solve. Euclid's fifth postulate. Most of Euclid's, not his fifth proposition, his fifth postulate. Most of Euclid's foundational material is so evident that it's easy to dismiss it as being trivial. Consider his 5 common notions. And these we would call today axioms to set up the system. Things which equal the same thing also equal one another. Duh. If equals are added to equals, then the wholes are equal. If equals are subtracted from equals, then the remainders are equal. Things which coincide with one another are equal one another. What's so hard about that? That's sort of obvious. And then he has 5 postulates, which again we would call axioms today. To draw a straight line from any point to any point. Well, sure. You have the 2 points on the piece of paper, you take a straight edge and a pencil or a pen, and you draw the line. Big deal. To produce a finite straight line continuously in a straight line. So we've already got a line. Now we want to continue it further. Well, you just line up your straight edge and you draw it. Again, big deal. To describe a circle with any center and radius. And what they mean is pick a center and then decide how big you want the radius and draw a circle. Well, that's not a big deal. You take your compasses, you measure, and you draw a circle. That's all there is to it. That all right angles are equal to one another. Again, it's kind of a duh. And so now you're thinking to yourself, I don't remember geometry being quite this easy, but this doesn't seem so hard. I bet I could do it again and it'd be a piece of cake. Until you get to his fifth postulate. And you get to the fifth postulate, and it just is not the same as the others. If a straight line falling on two straight lines makes the interior angles on the same side less than two right angles, the two straight lines, if produced indefinitely, meet on that side on which are the angles less than the two right angles. That's an entirely different category of the other elements. If two things equal the same thing, then they equal each other. This is something you have to sit and think about. This is something, I mean, this is why geometry has a widowmaker reputation. This is why there is a distinction made in high school. Are you going to go on to geometry, or are you going to continue in applied, in business mathematics or advanced arithmetic, if you will? Now, the fifth postulate is jarring in its complexity when compared to the first four postulates, or to the common notions. It is awkward and graceless and begs for a diagram to achieve full understanding in contrast to the naive simplicity of others. And there's the diagram there that I've drawn for you. You can see L1 and L2. Those are the two lines. You can see L is the line that's drawn on top of it. You then see the angles alpha and beta. I figure since Euclid was a Greek mathematician, I'd use Greek letters. That's just sort of a tribute to him. And so even that, if you don't work with geometry, that's kind of tough looking. Well, soon after the dissemination of the elements, mathematicians began a quest to prove that the fifth postulate was unnecessary. They said, this really is not a fundamental part of the world as we know it. This is just a theorem that Euclid has thrown in to impress everybody. And they wanted to banish it from the axioms of geometry. You don't need it. And so they worked on how can we get rid of it. Proclus, another Greek mathematician who flourished in the Common Era about 450, some 800 years after Euclid. 800 years after Euclid, they're working on the problem. And he wrote a commentary on attempted proofs of the fifth postulate. Omar Khayyam flourished around 1100, the Common Era. And he was a Persian mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, and physician, even though he is better known for his quatrains or rubaiyat. He also wrote a book on the subject called Explanations of the Difficulties of the Postulates of Euclid. This is 1,000 years after the book comes out, and they're still trying to figure what the fifth postulate is doing in there. How do we get rid of it, or what do we do with it? And it was not until the 19th century, more than 2,000 years after Euclid, that mathematicians realized that Euclid's fifth postulate tells you whether you're dealing with a plane, you're drawing your lines and diagrams on a flat plane, or whether you're drawing it on an ellipsoid, an egg, and the rules are different on an egg than they are on a piece of paper. Or maybe you're in what we would call a hyperbolic paraboloid, and that's a saddle surface where it curves up this way, then it goes that way, and it's all weird things. But that's what the fifth postulate does. It tells you what you're drawing on. What kind of surface is it? Nikolai Lobachevsky developed hyperbolic geometry, it was called, in 1830. And finally, in 1868, Eugenio Beltrami proved that the fifth postulate was independent, there is Beltrami, was independent of Euclid's other postulates and common notions and was essential for plane geometry. In other words, without Euclid's fifth postulate, you don't know where you're working. Now, if you're on a really big egg, it's hard to tell whether, when you draw straight lines, how they're going to intersect. But if you're on a small egg and you're drawing the lines, you can see real quick that they're going to intersect with the curves. And so Euclid's fifth postulate tells you where you are and what's going on. Now, what is important about these dates is that about 1874, when Sherlock Holmes was in college, Watson gets his MD in 78, so presumably started 4 years earlier. I don't know the exact educational schedule that they used in med school in England at that time. But 1878 he starts, so around 74 Watson is in med school. And we can expect around that time also Holmes was there. Now, remember that in 1868, Beltrami finally figured out what the fifth postulate was for. And they came to realize that the fifth postulate was the crowning glory of the elements. It took a mathematician of transcendent genius in 350 BCE to realize that plane geometry was impossible without the fifth postulate. That's Euclid. Now, a pre-med student in the 1870s would have taken the basic math required for chemistry and perhaps a touch of physics. Analytic geometry, some advanced algebra. That'll get you through basic physics and basic chemistry without any trouble at all. Such a student would not have dallied with the math professors, nor indulged in math seminars to see if such abstruse knowledge had practical value. I mean, his goal was to take chemistry and whatever was necessary to get that med degree, get the required math courses behind him. And with only a superficial exposure to algebra and analytic geometry, he could have very easily confused a postulate for a proposition. He might not have realized that there were 13 fifth propositions. Only one fifth postulate that had taken 2,000 years to solve. And thus we reach the only reasonable explanation of the perplexing problem of the puzzling proposition. Holmes knew enough about Victorian mathematics to be aware that Professor Moriarty's treatise on the binomial theorem had had a European vogue. And he must have known about the then contemporary advances in geometry of Beltrami and others. He evidently mentioned Euclid's fifth postulate when reprimanding Watson for tinging his reports of detection with Romanticism. Because the fifth, a problem that has taken 2,000 years to solve, it's just been solved 6 years ago. There are going to be a lot of seminars and symposiums on that. And so that would have been on the agenda of every math department in the world. And so Holmes mentions the fifth postulate when reprimanding Watson for tinging his reports of detection with Romanticism. And good old Watson, ever the faithful reporter, much like so many pre-med students before him, not to mention English and history majors, doubtlessly had difficulty crossing the pons asinorum, and he made the mistake of putting down proposition instead of postulate. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. And now it's time for the pause that refreshes. Before we leave, I would like to first of all ask that you come back because we have 2 more speakers. Secondly, I'd like to know if I could get a show of hands. Who here learned about this event on Facebook? Who here learned about it through like an event listing like Eventbrite or something like that? Okay, and who here learned about it from the library's website? Okay, thank you very much. Well, yes, yeah, Dan's a ringer. So if you would like to learn more about the Sherlockian societies in the area, you can speak to me. I can point out if there's someone who's a more appropriate person for you to speak. We'll be reconvening in at about 1:25, and I look forward to the next 2 speakers. So thank you, and have a good break. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Dr. Deborah Clark is a member of the BSI, ASH, and many other Sherlockian societies. She is a past Gasogene of the Watson's Tin Box, and I believe she is the longest-standing, regularly attending member of the Tin Box. When I got there around 1995, she had already been there for a year or two. She taught for many years at Goucher and Maryland School for the Deaf and is now retired. Deb has written many Sherlockian articles, has been a mainstay of the Maryland Sherlockian community, and has spoken at this program many times in the past. She will be speaking on The Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson for the Win.
No, the other one. No, that's me. The other one.
Oh, my problem. Well, I have you both, so you're going to have to remind people what you're speaking.
Friendship between Holmes and Watson.
The friendship between Holmes and Watson.
Good afternoon. Today I'd like to talk about the remarkable friendship between two of the most iconic individuals in print today, or actually in the past 140 plus or minus years, Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson. It is one of the most enduring and complex friendships in print. While the focus in scholarship is often on Holmes' brilliant and unique detective work and Watson's role as his chronicler, their relationship is at the heart of many of the stories. Even as a child, I was intrigued as I was with Holmes' gifts of minute observation, deduction, and logic. What stayed with me throughout the years has been their friendship. And what defines a friendship to me is loyalty, care, and concern about the other person. Of course, it goes without saying that if you also like them and enjoy their company, that's a plus. Though through Holmes and Watson's years of friendships, we witness a unique blend of intellect, loyalty, and complementing personalities. As Andy noted, Watson first met Holmes in a study of scarlet by sheer chance. I always found that remarkable. They know nothing about each other. They've met for 15 minutes maybe, and yet they decide to be roommates. Holmes's cold, logical demeanor and eccentric habits are nothing like Watson's own warm and more human approach. In fact, they could be the original odd couple. Anyway, despite their differences, they quickly seem to form a bond through shared intellectual curiosity. Watson, a trained doctor, intrigued by Holmes' sharp mind and abilities, and Holmes, who appreciate Watson's grounded perspective. What makes their friendship work is how their differing strengths complement each other. Holmes relies more on Watson than just as a companion. Watson is his sounding board, his confidant, and in many cases, his moral compass or anchor. For example, in the short novel, The Sign of Four, Holmes and Watson are now partners in the detective business as well as roommates. Holmes is wrapped in a complicated case involving lost Indian treasure and long-ago betrayals. Watson, who becomes romantically involved with their client, Mary Morstan, in the course of the novel is torn between his personal life and his loyalty to Holmes. Holmes, ever the professional, tends to dismiss personal relationships, but Holmes stands by him, displaying his unwavering support despite his growing personal commitments. At the same time, their partnership isn't one-sided. Holmes is a brilliant detective. However, Watson brings qualities that make him indispensable to Holmes' work and life. Watson often provides a window into Holmes' world for the reader. His observations about Holmes' character, his emotional detachment and sometimes unorthodox methods, and his inability to connect with others show us the human side of his genius. Watson acts as the heart to Holmes' mind, and his more empathetic nature helps to balance Holmes' often cold rationalism. In The Scandal in Bohemia, for example, Watson describes Holmes' reaction to the adventuress and opera singer Irene Adler. Holmes, typically unemotional, is deeply moved by her intellect and beauty. She was the only woman ever to beat him, and he always refers to her as the woman. But he reveals this only to Watson. This gives us a glimpse into Holmes' vulnerability, but it's something that Watson understands and respects and would never, ever think of abusing. Likewise, in the climactic story, The Final Problem, the story of Holmes' death at Reichenbach Falls, Watson's loyalty is on full display. Care and concern are expressed through loyalty and sacrifice. Watson does everything in his power to follow Holmes into danger and protect him, even if he doesn't completely understand the danger. Holmes' apparent death shakes Watson to his very core. Even when it's clear that Watson has disappeared over the falls, Watson refuses to believe his friend is really gone. Before confronting Moriarty, Holmes takes the time to write a final letter to Watson, summarizing the case and sorta thanking him for his friendship. But as usual, it is understated and restrained. He writes, "I'm pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of Professor Moriarty's presence, though I fear it is a cost which will give great pain to my friends, and especially, my dear Watson, to you." He ends it by saying, "Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes," his whole name, like Watson doesn't know that. Holmes rarely expresses emotion, but before what he believes will be his death, he acknowledges their bond transcends mere professional relationship. Likewise, at the very end of the story, Watson says, "I shall ever regard him as the best and wisest man I have ever known." That used to really get me as a kid. Moving forward, in The Adventure of the Empty House, Holmes is devastated after Holmes' apparent death and then his wife's death on top of it. It is as if he has lost a part of his identity. He returns to his medical practice, consumed by grief, unable to accept the loss of his closest friend. When Holmes reappears, Watson's reaction isn't just one of surprise, although he does faint at the sight of a resurrected Holmes, but also immense relief and joy. This moment demonstrates how much Holmes means to Watson beyond the mere case-solving partner. This is a digression. Did y'all see the Robert Downey Jr. movies of Sherlock Holmes? Okay. Remember the part where Holmes reveals himself to Watson at Simpson's in the Strand after he's been dead? What happens next? Watson slugs him. And I get that. I can understand that Watson would have loved to have done that at some point in time, but not in the stories. Anyway, although Holmes can seem detached, he consistently shows that he values Watson's well-being and friendship, especially when Watson faces danger. Then Holmes acts quickly to protect him. In The Three Garrett Debs, when they corner the counterfeiter Killer Evans, who's trying to rob Mr. Garrideb and recover his printing press hidden in Garrideb's house, Watson is shot, and Holmes' mask of logic and reserve drop completely. He says, "You're not hurt, Watson. For God's sake, say you're not hurt." Holmes' voice trembles with emotion, and when he realizes Watson's wound is not serious, he says to Evans, "By the Lord, it is well for you. If you'd killed Watson, you would not have gotten out of this room alive." Watson then says, "It was worth a wound, it was worth many wounds, to know the depth of loyalty and love which lay behind the cold mask." For the one and only time, I caught a glimpse of the great heart as well as the great brain. All my years of humble but single-minded service culminated in that moment of revelation. This shows Holmes' deep affection and fear for Watson's safety. His typical reserve completely breaks down. Watson, on the other hand, his devotion is constant. He admires Holmes, worries for him, and often risks his own safety to help. After Watson got shot, his first thought isn't for himself, but for Holmes. He just says, "Oh, it's nothing, Holmes, it's just a scratch." This calmness reassures Holmes, showing his own emotional steadiness in a crisis. In The Dying Detective, Holmes fools Watson by pretending to be on the brink of death from a rare Cooley disease, possibly black Formosa corruption, which I love. But he won't allow Holmes to examine him. But he still lets him stay in the room, but he says he can't touch anything. When an alleged murderer arrives to finish Holmes off, Holmes says, "There's just room behind the head of my bed. Quick, man, if you love me, don't budge. Whatever happens, don't move. Just listen with all your ears." Now, if you remember the Jeremy Brett series, Holmes's bed is a single brass bed. There is no, you can't hide back there. So in my imagination, I'm thinking of a gigunda Victorian mahogany bed with a huge headboard, which you could hide behind. Anyway, later Holmes reveals all of this playing sick has been a ruse to trap the murderer. And at least he apologizes for the distress it's caused. To Watson, he says, "Do you imagine I have no respect for your medical talents?" Well, maybe, but, but as usual, Watson forgives him. But this does show that Holmes has a protective instinct. Even in deception, he wants to ensure Watson's safety. Then in the Adventure of the Devil's Foot, Watson persuades Holmes to rest and recuperate after working too hard in Cornwall. Now, I should say this happens several other times, but this is a more dramatic one. Okay, while they're there, Holmes becomes involved in solving the murder of one of the Tregennis siblings, the other two having been driven mad for an unknown cause. So what happens? Holmes figures out he's found some powder, and he thinks this might be the cause of the problem, so he decides to do an experiment. And Watson, of course, is going to be right there with him. So they put this powder on this thing, and it does its thing, and they breathe it, and they start to hallucinate big time. So what happens? Holmes is nearly driven mad by an experiment with a deadly hallucinogenic powder. Watson intervenes just in time. He says, "I dashed from my chair, threw my arms around Holmes, and we lurched together through the door." Afterwards, after they recuperated a little bit, Holmes says, "Upon my word, Watson, I owe you both my thanks and an apology. It was an unjustifiable experiment, even for oneself, and doubly so for a friend. I'm really very sorry." Watson replies, "You know it's my greatest joy and privilege to help you." Watson's quick action literally saves Holmes' life, a direct physical act of care. So what we see throughout the stories is Holmes shows that he's a caring person and a good friend through his actions, especially when Watson's safety or loyalty are at stake. Watson shows this through devotion, standing by Holmes at every turn and providing human warmth to balance out Holmes' intellect. Their friendship is built on mutual respect, loyalty, and affection. So, the friendship between Holmes and Watson is one of the most enduring, influential relationships in literary history. Their partnership exemplifies the power of complementary personalities, mutual respect, and deep loyalty. While Holmes is a mastermind, Watson is his grounded counterpart, offering emotional balance, practical support, and a human perspective. Their friendship isn't perfect, but it's real, and that's what makes it so compelling. In the end, it's not just Holmes' cases that captivate readers, but the way Watson describes their friendship, the moments of joy, their moments of danger, their shared understanding. Together, they've become an indelible part of history. Thank you very much.
Our last speaker is Carla Koop, BSI, ASH, and a past organizer of this program. She stepped up to keep it alive after Beth Austin, who had run this program for several years and whose birthday it is today, passed away. Carla is a past Gasogene of Watson's Tin Box and is a member of all the local Sherlockian societies. She is a retired editor of Black Cat Mystery Magazine and Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine and has edited several books as well. She has been a member of the Mystery Writers of America for over 20 years and was one of the founding members of the Mid-Atlantic chapter. She's also appeared on many panels at Malice Domestic and is a member of the Sisters of Crime. She's also written several pastiches for Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine, and she will be speaking on The Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson for the Win.
I'll talk fast. I've chosen The Hound of the Baskervilles as my favorite selection from Canon, not only because it's an excellent Gothic tale, perfect for the autumn, when the nights draw in and the wind in the eaves sounds like the sighs of lost spirits, but also because it's a celebration of Dr. John H. Watson. Holmes is largely absent from the story, so Watson can let loose his inner romantic, his penchant for the outré, the Gothic, the mysterious, still influenced but not constrained by Holmes's insistence on the scientific and logical. Throughout Watson's narration, there's an air of mystery and unseen terror, the threat of supernatural forces at work, and echoes of past tragedies in the present. Watson shines in Hound, and more than just a conductor of light, as Holmes labels him. His perspicacious and insightful narration also displays many sides to his honorable and adventuresome character. As is so often the case, Watson starts the story in the rooms he shares with Holmes, a thoroughly domestic setting where he and Holmes exercise their powers of observation on a walking stick. Although Holmes pooh-poohs many of Watson's observations, the careful reader will note that in this case, both men are right about 50% of the time. Holmes hand waves his erroneous conclusions, almost blaming the client for disarranging his deductions. So much for relegating Watson to the role of merely stimulating genius. And yet, like many friendships where a certain amount of teasing goes on, there's a close connection between the two men, as Debbie mentioned. I'll leave it up to you to decide exactly how close that might be. But Watson shows the mutual depth of feeling in their relationship. And in this story, he doesn't even need to display the histrionics from The Three Garridebs. Despite Holmes's razzing of Watson's intellectual capabilities, he also asserts there is no man who is better worth having at your side when you are in a tight place. No one can say so more confidently than I. Watson is, of course, flattered, and honest man that he is, replies, "The promise of adventure had always a fascination for me, and I was complimented by the words of Holmes." In addition to his encomium on Watson's bravery, Holmes also shows his attachment to his friend by his fear for Watson when he leaves for Dartmoor, saying that he's uneasy about sending him into danger. "I give you my word that I shall be very glad to have you back safe and sound in Baker Street once more." Even at the railway station, Holmes sees off Watson and Sir Henry, and he implores Watson to keep your revolver near you day and night and never relax your precautions. These are the exhortations of a staunch friend. When it comes to Watson, Holmes is certainly not a calculating machine, and the warmth and devotion of Watson's friendship with Holmes is evident in every word he writes. Now, early on in Hound, Watson is called upon to limn the other characters of the story. This is when his gift of description comes to its own. Not only is he able to portray the individual's exterior, Watson also immediately sheds light on the innermost nature of the person in these lovely little capsule portraits. He begins with Dr. James Mortimer, whose forgotten cane caused the earlier observational skirmish between Holmes and Watson. Mortimer is a very tall, thin man with a long nose like a beak. His frock coat was dingy and his trousers frayed, and he walked with a general air of peering benevolence. We can visualize him clearly as he shambles through the story, and as a local doctor, he is deeply involved with all the denizens of the moor. On the train headed towards Devonshire, Watson studies Sir Henry Baskerville, and his description of that newly elevated baronet references the glories of the past as displayed in Sir Henry's physiognomy and bearing. As I looked at his dark and expressive face, I felt more than ever how true a descendant he was of that long line of high-blooded, fiery, and masterful men who, there were pride, valor, and strength in his thick brows, his sensitive nostrils, and his large hazel eyes. He goes on to postulate, possibly, yes, if on that forbidding moor a difficult and dangerous quest should lie before us, this was at least a comrade for whom one might venture to take a risk with the certainty that he would bravely share it. At this point, Watson has no idea exactly how prophetic his words are, how much Sir Henry will risk, and how bravely he will meet the danger. Once on the moor, we meet with Jack Stapleton, a man who presents an innocuous and bland exterior, yet Watson describes him as a small, slim, clean-shaven, prim-faced man, flaxen-haired and lean-jawed. Is the latter an unconscious, or perhaps it's a conscious, anticipation of Holmes's later comparison of a devious, plotting Stapleton to a big, lean-jawed Pike? Watson goes on to accurately observe there's a dry glitter in his eyes, a firm set of his thin lips, which goes with a positive and possibly a harsh nature. Without knowing Stapleton's secrets yet, he captures the man perfectly. There are other important characters in the story, but the all-encompassing one is the moor itself. Watson has always displayed a painterly eye for detail, and in this case, he really lets it rip. His evocative descriptions of Dartmoor and Baskerville Hall not only conjure up detailed images for the reader, but also add to the atmosphere of dread and impending doom. At the first glimpse of the moor, Watson says, "Over the green squares of fields and the low curve of a wood, there rose in the distance a gray, melancholy hill with a strange, jagged summit, dim and vague in the distance, like some fantastic landscape in a dream. They continue their journey, and the landscape grows even more unwelcoming. The road in front of us grew bleaker and wilder over huge russet and olive slopes, sprinkled with giant boulders. Now and then we passed a moorland cottage, walled and roofed in stone, with no creeper to break its harsh outline. It's that little detail which really brings it to life. When Watson, Baskerville, and Mortimer learn of the escaped convict, and not just any convict, but the worst of the worst, this knowledge reinforces the sense of ever-present evil lurking and watching. In front of us rose the huge expanse of the moor, mottled with gnarled and craggy cairns and tors. A cold wind swept down from it and set us shivering. Somewhere there, on that desolate plain, was lurking this fiendish man, hiding in a burrow like a wild beast, his heart full of malignancy against the whole race which had cast him out. It needed but this to complete the grim suggestiveness of the barren waste, the chilling night, and the darkling sky. The moor's brooding presence continues as the story grows, and even the supposed haven of Baskerville Hall offers just a tenuous sense of security. Despite the hall's trappings of civilization and the promise of 1,000 candle-power Swan and Edison electric lamp outside, you can never forget that the moor, with all its wild and dangerous potential, lurks just outside your door. Once on the moor, however, there is no place of succor or safety. There rose suddenly out of the vast gloom of the moor that strange cry which I had already heard upon the borders of the great Grimpen Mire. It came with the wind through the silence of the night, a long, deep mutter, then a rising howl, and then the sad moan in which it died away. Again and again it sounded, and the whole air was throbbing with it, strident, wild, and menacing. And at this point, Watson presents us with this lovely dichotomy. He acutely feels the power of the unknown and the unknowable. And if he didn't, how could he write these vivid and emotionally driven descriptions? Yet he also tries to reflect Holmes's logic and rationality. A spectral hound which leaves material footmarks and fills the air with its howling is surely not to be thought of. If I have one quality upon earth, it is common sense, and nothing will persuade me to believe in such a thing. To do so would be to descend to the level of these poor peasants, who are not content with a mere fiend dog, but must needs describe him with the hellfire shooting from his mouth and eyes. Holmes would not listen to such fancies, and I am his agent. Very brave words, but I'm not sure who he's trying to convince, the reader or himself. But he has implicit faith in Holmes, and when the final trap is ready to be sprung, Watson again calls upon his gift of description to set the scene. The men are in place on the moor, waiting for Sir Henry and the hound. Their nerves are on edge, and they're filled with tension, not knowing what to expect. Then comes the fog, creeping over the ground, ready to ruin Holmes's plans. Already, the first thin wisps of it were curling across the golden square of the lighted window. The farther wall of the orchard was already invisible, and the trees were standing out of a swirl of white vapor. As we watched it, the fog wreaths came crawling round both corners of the house and rolled slowly into one dense bank on which the upper floor and the roof floated like a strange ship on a shadowy sea. At the story's climax, Watson's narration does not disappoint. First, there is a thin, crisp, continuous patter from somewhere in the heart of that crawling bank. The cloud was within 50 yards of where we lay, and we glared at it, all three, uncertain what horror was about to break from the heart of it. You can cue the spooky music here. And then the mystery is solved, and the enigma reveals itself. A hound it was, an enormous coal-black hound, but not such a hound as mortal eyes have ever seen. Fire burst from its open mouth. Its eyes glowed with a smoldering glare. Its muzzle and hackles and dewlap were outlined in flickering flame. Never in the delirious dream of a disordered brain could anything more savage, more appalling, more hellish be conceived than that dark form and savage face which broke upon us out of the wall of fog. After a moment's hesitation, however, both Holmes and Watson recover themselves and fire their guns at the hound, hitting him at least once. But that cry of pain from the hound had blown all our fears to the winds. If he was vulnerable, he was mortal, and if we could wound him, we could kill him. We heave a sigh of relief as the loose ends of the story are wrapped up, and Watson summons up a few words for the man whose evil plotting set off this chain of events. Somewhere in the heart of the great Grimpen mire, down in the foul slime of the huge morass which had sucked him in, this cold and cruel-hearted man is forever buried. At last, logic and reason prevail, and we return to the rational world of 221B Baker Street, where the story of the Hound of the Baskervilles began. But along this journey, we see and observe Watson's gifts of friendship, intelligence, bravery, perspicacity, and an ability to tap into his inner romantic to bring the reader along with him through this thrilling tale. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have the inquisition of the audience. So if you have pen and paper, and each of the speakers has a question or two, would the speakers stand up and do their questions? Dan?
Okay, who was the successor to Christopher Morley in the BSI?
Who was the successor of Christopher Morley in the BSI?
Okay, number 2, Matt.
Which character does Simon Goodenough appear in the photograph in Study in Scarlet? Which character did the author
In
Simon
the
Goodenough
photograph, in the study of the scarlet that Matt showed, which character of the canon did Goodenough pose as? Evie.
Whom did Mary Sutherland want Holmes to find for her?
Who
Did Mary Sutherland?
did Mary Sutherland want Holmes to find her? Frank?
There is a bridge that is mentioned that an animal cannot get across. What animal is it that cannot cross the bridge?
Eddie?
What disease did Holmes pretend to have as a dying detective?
Okay. So,
Jefferson Hope was the literary character that Simon Peter.
Evie?
It was her fiancé, Hosmer Angel, who disappeared on their wedding day. So I think her fiancé's probably.
Brent?
It was the ass that could not get across the bridge, the pond's ass and all.
Debbie?
You can either say a coolie disease or you can say the black Formosa corruption.
Carla?
Ooh, thank you. You can say Jack Stapleton, James Mortimer, Sir Henry Baskerville, or the Moor. Any of those are appropriate.
Okay, there were 6 questions. Who got all 6 right? Who got it right? You win. Thanks to Matt for giving a prize for this. I'll give it to you afterwards. Thanks to the Pratt. I want to thank again Geneve. I had a list here of people I wanted to thank. Geneve Purchase, the Deputy Chief Central Library, State Library Resource Center, and Bernard Smith, the manager of the AV team, and Jonathan Paris Santana. I remember this from last year. JP, who's been our IT guy, our audio engineer today. And I want to thank all of our speakers. And if anyone would like to speak at a future program, please contact me. My email address is als221@gmail.com. And if you want to learn about any of the other science societies, again, see me. Thanks again to the speakers. Thanks again to our partners at the Pratt. And we'll see you next year at the 47th Pratt program.
Check, check, 1, 2. Before anyone leaves, if you have parked in the Franklin Street garage, please see me for a parking voucher. Thanks.